Hi there. Good morning, everyone. All right. Well, today we're going to be talking about something really important, software bill of materials, or SBOMs. I'm joined here today by Cortez Frasier over at FOSSA, and I'll start by just checking in. How are you doing, Cortez? We can do a little bit of an intro for yourself, a bit of background on FOSSA. I'll do the same, and we can just jump right in.
Absolutely. I love it. Audio coming through okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah, sounding perfect.
Awesome. So my name's Cortez Frasier Jr. I'm director of product at FOSSA. I've been working at FOSSA for about 4 years now, which feels absolutely crazy. FOSSA is a software supply chain company, and so we do all things software composition analysis, SBOM generation, SBOM import and management, as well as open source lifecycle management as well. So think vulnerabilities, license obligations, and anything else in between, end of life support, etc. So really excited to be here. I have a ton of customers both in the medical device space and others who are acutely aware with how they're looking to then engage in FDA submissions and other similar regulations. So look forward to an engaging conversation. Over to you, Trevor.
Yeah, great to have you here. So I'm Trevor Slattery. I'm the COO over at Blue Goat Cyber. We handle medical device cybersecurity through and through. So a lot on the regulatory process, any cybersecurity testing, your penetration testing, fuzz testing, dynamic static testing, things of that nature. And oftentimes this involves a lot of SBOM management. I would say more often than not, it's going to involve some SBOM management. And so really excited to talk about this. I think this is a really timely conversation. This is a very hot topic in the industry right now. And I think there's a lot of fun stuff that we can get into. So we can go ahead and jump in. Well, the first thing is why SBOMs are becoming a little bit more important right now. So regulatory expectations are changing really, really fast. And I'm sure you over at FOSSA have seen a lot of this, seeing the FDA trying to clamp down on more and more, seeing the MDR try to come in more and more. But it's becoming especially sensitive at this point, as SBOMs can paint a very strong narrative of what the level of risk looks like in a device. Regulators really want to see that they're done well. I think that it's also a little bit of a technical problem that we're facing. The SBOM tool management, you're obviously going to know a lot more about this than I do, is trying to catch up with the industry, but it's a very timely point for us to dive into what SBOMs need to do and how they need to be a bit more mature.
Yeah, it's an incredibly good topic. I would say incredibly timely for lots of reasons. So, the regulation I think is becoming incredibly intense. Obviously, no secret that there's been a few recent announcements in the AI space that we anticipate is going to exponentially increase the amount of patches that are going to be necessary in the future, because older components that maybe have not typically raised the same level of vulnerability scrutiny, we suspect that Mythos and Mythos-like products coming in the future are going to find tons of vulnerabilities there. And so ultimately the key is being able to be in a position where you can actually truly identify end-to-end what's in your software from direct and transitive dependencies. And it's also interesting because it happens to be anyway that a medical device space in particular is also one of the hardest spaces in order for you to get an accurate component graph from. Ultimately I think of my SBOM journey in two phases. One, how do I get an accurate list of components? Two, how do I then ensure that I get find some interesting metadata associated with those? On the accurate list of components piece, oftentimes you're going to have to combine, a few different techniques depending on what you have access to. Do you have direct source code access? Are you only getting a binary where you have no source whatsoever? Are you getting maybe a halfway done SBOM from some other supplier that you then have to combine together with your source SBOM to then kind of get to like that final state? And so all of these challenges kind of combine together to make it a really interesting problem space, and one that oftentimes takes both tooling and process, which I think is not uncommon, in order to kind of get to a good outcome. So one, it's never been more important. I think from an SBOM perspective, I think that every single company on the planet is going to start requiring SBOMs as part of their software purchasing process, in addition to the requirements that we're already seeing from FDA. Obviously, we'll talk a little bit about the regulatory space here in a bit. But I am incredibly passionate, and I want to emphasize that a overwhelming wave of net new vulnerabilities is definitely coming. And the only way to be able to respond to that is to have visibility into what you're even using in the first place.
100%. And I think that's going to be the biggest deciding factor between security teams who can adapt and respond and security teams who fall behind, is understanding where to prioritize. And we're going to talk a little bit about Vex, which is a good way to help out with this process as well. But I think that the industry is getting a little bit more towards a point where this can be supported. Diving into these regulatory requirements, it seems to be global. It's this wide-reaching push to have SBOMs integrated into the development of medical products, even branching out of outside of medical products into like the Cyber Resilience Act through the EU. SBOMs are becoming more and more effective throughout any digital products. I know FOSSA works in a wide variety of different verticals, and so medical is obviously going to be a major one, but you spend a lot of work in the automotive space and a few others as well. And so I think that regulated industries in general are no strangers to SBOMs, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Do you expect this to start to push into a bit more of traditional tech industries, less typically regulated spaces?
Right. Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it will be a bit of like a trickle down effect, meaning that the less regulated spaces will likely get kind of slurped up as a part of this process, mostly because it will very much, and it's actually arguably already at this point, where if you are any software vendor and someone asks for an SBOM from you, that is at this point a litmus test of do you actually have a handle over what's in your environment? And so it's less of like, hey, this regulation is actually commanding me to do this, and more of a how modern of an organization are you, and are you actually capable of reliably asserting what's in your software products? I think what a lot of our customers in particular are quickly finding out is that as they look across their supplier and vendor landscape, 50% of them are actually not capable at all at producing an SBOMs, or it's a very manual process by which they're doing, so that by the time they actually produce that particular SBOM, they've already moved on to like a different version, or that particular one is no longer accurate or in use. And so 100% yes, I expect to see beyond just the regulatory landscape. I think it's even funny because I think you're going to even see beyond just like tech companies in general, which is if I'm going to purchase software, if I want to bring it into my space, I have to have a sense of safety or a sense of assurance that this particular platform is going to be brought in. And the last thing I'll kind of say on it is one of the other kind of benefits I think of the emergence of vibe coding, which I am absolutely all the way on the train, absolutely enjoying all the things that we're building in my kind of like free time. Whether my engineering team likes it or not is another conversation. But nonetheless, we're going to see exponentially more code being generated by probably people who don't really have any business generating code, to be quite honest. So there's not a ton of secure practices in place. There's not a ton of obfuscation of keys. Like there's just going to be so many opportunities for threat actors to take advantage. And so that in and of itself is what's going to drive that requirement for software supply chain transparency, from my view.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think I do want to drill into the vibe coding a little bit more, because this is something I 100% love it. I'm with you there. It is super exciting. I think the rate at which you can push code is astonishing. But one big concern that I do have with it, and I was doing a test for an internal tool that we've been working on. We developed a little bit more of a formal solution with very minimal requirements built into it. But I tried to vibe code something very similar to see what would happen. And I generated an SBOM for it with over 400 components. And this was basically a front end making, I think, 4 API calls. That was it. And it pulled in 400 third-party components into the SBOM. And so I think that there is a risk of excessive complexity. And especially going back to your point before, I think we're going to see that the vulnerability landscape is rapidly going to evolve when we see these frontier models that are getting pushed out that can rip through such a massive amount of code and discover previously unknown vulnerabilities. I think this excessive inclusion of components is going to become the new format of risk that we're going to see prevalent across a wide range of industries.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would argue that, the prevalence of vibe coding. So one, to your point, right, you're bringing in a ton of packages that you have really no idea about. You give one prompt before you know it, you've built an entire front end application. You think that you're only using 10 libraries and you've pulled in 1,000, right? I think that use case is very much accurate. I think what we're also seeing is that there is a level of software discipline that is lacking in vibe coders, rightfully so, because none of us are probably proper developers. And, recently with like Vercel, actually, and I don't want to come down negative in that organization because I think it's incredible. We use it personally. I absolutely love them, but they just had a pretty massive leak where, a lot of the sensitive credentials that were there were stored. And of course, it's still good old social engineering, which will always and continue to be the number one way that threat actors are successful. I think someone got access to an internal employee's Google account or something, and then was able to then go grab a whole bunch of unencrypted keys. But the question is, why were keys even unencrypted in the first place? Why were they being stored in plain text? And, I think all that comes down to likely a reduction in the engineering standards that will be applied, which is a proper trade-off, of course. The exponential velocity that you get, I think you have to accept a amount of reduction there, but the only way for you to know about those risks is to then still have a really high quality and solid software supply chain program in place that still operates as your gate, so that way you're not affecting engineering velocity in any material way, but you still have these guardrails in place to protect you in the back end.
100%. Yep.
So.
And that'll tie us right into what does actually go into an SBOM. So without diving too far into any of the requirements for any specific industry, but an SBOM in general is just going to be a list. It is the bill of materials within your software. It's a list of all of the components, the versions, their suppliers and licensees, as well as how they all link together. So I think that's a very important part as well that we're talking about, is how these different components link together and what dependency relationships look like. This is a mandatory part of SBOMs for pretty much any regulated industry. And what we're really trying to understand is what components are calling other components. How reachable are these different components? This is going to go right into a little bit of a newer push, which is VEX. And so this is going to describe a little bit more about the exploitability context. Now, VEX from a regulated perspective is becoming more and more of a push. The FDA specifically wants to see how you are describing the reachability of different vulnerabilities within the SBOM. Are you seeing similar pushes in other industries to have VEX documents provided along with the software bill of materials?
Absolutely. It's becoming like the de facto standard. I've actually gotten a lot of maybe kind of pushback in the past of kind of like championing VEX as not the only value of SBOMs by any means, but one of the more premier pieces of value. Because I think ultimately, if you think about some of the components that you include, or some of the fields that you include in SBOM, so your component, your version, your supplier, another huge one that I'm going to always call out is like whatever unique identifier that you're using. So whether it's a Perl, whether it's a CPE, whether it's an Omnivore ID, like whatever that unique identifier is, that is the signal by which that you use to constantly get net new vulnerabilities as they come out, because obviously that's not a point in time decision. And so being able to leverage VEX and be able to say throughout the life cycle of this particular vulnerability, I can indicate to you whether I'm affected or not affected, more than likely to let you know when this is like in triage or in progress, and then we can update you on the outcome of that. I think is a much more realistic approach, because the reality is the moment a vulnerability comes out, no one is expecting you to immediately know whether you're impacted or not. At least, without having to do some initial research, where the developers have to dive into the code. I think that there's a lot of, reachability like products out there that are absolutely fantastic or in a good first path. And there's other let me focus on direct and criticals and highs that have a fix available. There's a lot of like really blunt approaches to take. But ultimately in an ideal world, you want to be going through every single vulnerability that you have, assuming that you have this capacity, getting an assertion on your exploitability of that, and then be able to communicate, any impacts associated there. So that like continuous motion of new vulnerabilities coming out on a regular basis, me updating my kind of software supply chain on whether they're impacted or not, and then constantly giving them updates on remediation methods is what SCA has always been. And we're now just codifying that into another format in the form of VEX, for the SBOM standpoint. And so where we're seeing this a ton is in any supplier vendor relationships, regardless of whether you're in the medical device space or not. So think automotive manufacturers, embedded device tooling, anybody who is shipping any other like OEM products that they're owning, all of them are completely all on board with VEX, because that is the best way for them to kind of get a high quality risk landscape.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think it makes sense that once we're building things in with VEX, it makes it a little bit more of a streamlined process as opposed to this deep manual effort. I think there's still some room for improvement within the medical context, specifically because we are trying to do this assessment with a safety blend as well.
Yeah.
And right now, it's a little bit of a split approach, and that is ultimately the way that safety and security risk management tie in. They are meant to be parallel and independent processes with distinct tie-in. And so it could be that VEX isn't necessarily the best place to have this, but it is still a very important element of the SBOM itself. So with different SBOM formats, I know there are two main common industry standards, SPDX and then CycloneDX. So SPDX is a little bit of an older format. That was the original SBOM go-to, generally used for licensing compliance, which, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Cortez, from my understanding, SBOMs were originally more for licensing compliance.
Absolutely.
And I think that's where CycloneDX came in. It's much, much, much more lightweight than SPDX. It's a little bit more flexible. It's in native format that a lot of security researchers and engineers expect to see.
Yep.
and it ties in very well to these VEX documents.
Mhm.
Now, the FDA does not care which one you provide.
Yep.
They even specify that it just has to be machine readable. So you are technically allowed to provide your SBOM in a list in a CSV document.
Mhm.
I recommend that you do that for more reasons than I can count. But if you're going between SPDX and Cyclone DX, both are going to provide a lot of insight. At what point did you start seeing this shift more towards SBOMs for security? And do you think that, I know that licensing concerns are a little bit more minimal, but I'd also be curious to hear your thoughts on what are some of the licensing risks that could come up, things such as the copyleft licenses, and where do you see that in the space right now?
Absolutely. These are all really phenomenal questions. I think kind of first and foremost, we've been seeing a interesting shift, I would say almost geographically as well, of where like a lot of our European customers have historically been SPDX shops. I think that goes back to the lineage of they were also some of the ones who were the deepest on the open source license compliance side from a regulation standpoint. I think there was also the tooling, in particular when you think about like C++, Linux ecosystems, lower level embedded frameworks, they also heavily leaned into SPDX as their primary format. And so think of like Yocto and Buildroot and some of these other frameworks, they were primarily producing SPDX SBOMs. And so I think that is the reason why that kind of captured some initial traction. Now, I do completely agree with you, and I've gotten some slack about this. I'm sorry, I have friends on both sides of the aisle, but Cyclone DX, I think, is the far superior standard for the purposes of security. And I do think that SPDX did a fantastic job with their 3.0 framework to kind of really revamp and deal with some of the struggles that they were dealing with previously. And that also includes things like native VEX support. Even though I do agree with you, it should probably be a standalone document that you maintain separately, so that way you can continuously update it. And so that is kind of the starting point that we've seen, as well as SPDX 2.3 introduced Perl support. And I think that was another like kind of huge lead that Cyclone DX had an advantage, which had always been a very Perl focused kind of SBOM, which leans heavily into that kind of unique identification. So what we have now seen, though, pretty dramatically and rapidly is the vast majority of people who are starting a net new SBOM program are primarily centralizing around Cyclone DX, or they're looking to convert. And so if they're originally starting in an SPDX format, we see a lot of customers that will then import an SPDX SBOM into a tool like FOSSA or others, convert that into their Cyclone DX format to then combine with other SBOMs coming from other tooling that they have. And so you see a lot of interoperability kind of in that nature.
Yeah.
Now going into like the license compliance side, I actually think that this is such an interesting topic because I think oftentimes, one, it's obviously just a healthy thing to do for the open source maintainer ecosystem. You're essentially getting a ton of free labor and development off of these developers. The very least you can do is give them proper attribution for the packages that you're using. And so it's, there's obviously this level of goodwill associated with it. But beyond that, it can actually turn into a pretty massive security problem for you, in particular in the medical device and any embedded space. If you are using and there's a couple of reasons for that. One, kind of just for those who are not aware, oftentimes license obligations are kind of thought of in like permissive and restrictive licenses. Permissive licenses are one where the only real obligations you have to do is do things like reproduce the license text or give copyright notice or just give credit back to the open source maintainer is essentially the requirements there. Those are fairly permissive to use. Think of like MIT, Apache, and some of those other licenses. Then you have more restrictive licenses, which we categorize in like weak and strong copyleft, depending on how much of your source code that you then have to open source based on actually using that particular license. And so you can think of that as like some of the AGPL variants or the GPL 2.1 variants of where if I am using a particular piece of open source code that I modify in a material way to make into what they'll call a derivative work, and I don't then contribute that change back to the open source code base, I've now violated those terms and I will now then be forced to open source my now proprietary code. Trevor, you can imagine from a security perspective, if I have this proprietary IP that I'm now being forced to open source, that is both an IP struggle for me, but more importantly, that's now a security concern because now everyone has an exact playbook for you on how to then take advantage of that particular code base. So that's something that we like to spend a lot of time, really kind of leaning into, which is, yes, I agree that the open source license concerns are definitely a secondary concern to just a pure malicious vulnerability, but that can turn into a security concern for you very quickly if you don't handle those obligations properly.
100%. And I think within the medical space, we are actually seeing less and less of, in industry in general, We're seeing less of these restrictive copyleft licenses. And
Mhm.
I think we're seeing that trend in the medical space, but it's not a guarantee. And part of that is due to these massive development cycles that you can expect for a medical device. Think on the span of a decade as opposed to the span of a year to build a medical product. And so there's all this carryover from a software library that got included 10 years ago in this device, and it's just now coming out into the daylight and getting ready for a regulatory submission.
Absolutely.
That's the point where you have this product out on the market. That's the point where you're using this in a live, real environment. And that's the point where these concerns become very serious. I think similarly to how we're seeing the industry evolve a little bit with this, we're also seeing what the regulators want done evolving. So 2023 was the genesis of SBOM requirements for the FDA. This is when everything became serious with cybersecurity. Things were fairly relaxed. We have actually seen the requirements around it and the scrutiny really tighten up over the past couple of years. We're now seeing that a lot of manufacturers are getting pushback if they're not providing VEX or some equivalent assessment on the actual exploitability of vulnerabilities. Just identifying that there is a component with a vulnerability is not enough anymore. We need to understand, what does that actually mean? Can this actually lead to significant harm? Another very common thing that we are seeing more and more of is this as far as the SBOM goes? Do you actually have any more components underneath each of these? We have seen some questions around the accuracy of an SBOM, if it seems like it's going to be too light for the technology that we would expect to work with here. And seeing that transitive relationship can be really difficult. Now, I'm going to throw a question I'm sure you get all the time. And since we're talking about the accuracy and completion of SBOMs, I'm going to bring up everyone's favorite, C and C++.
Yes.
This is a very known issue within the SBOM space. I know there's not really a solved solution at this point, but how do you see this affecting some of the regulatory expectations? And how do you see this as a hurdle that manufacturers have to account for?
Yeah, this is such a really, really good question. And it's actually funny because I was just recently in a conversation with one of our customers and actually some of the FDA regulators themselves, because they were trying to push back a little bit on what an expectation is for C and C++ SBOMs. So taking a slight step back, if you think about some of the challenges with C and C++, the first challenge is, as compared to like a package managed ecosystem like NPM or Maven or pip, there oftentimes is unlimited ways that you can go about including packages. And so you may do something that we call like vendored components, where you're actually, either manually or probably more realistically on an automated basis, pulling in the source code from an open source package like OpenSSL or something of that nature. You're then vendoring in that entire source code into your directory, and then you use that package locally for whatever it is that you need on the devices. There's then, compiled binaries that you're including from a C++ perspective. There's then also, sometimes you have to like optimize the C++ packages, and so you're not bringing in the entire package. Maybe you're only bringing in one or two, .c, .h, .o files, whatever it is that you're looking for, that have the complete set of functionality. And so then the challenge is, how do you on an automated basis identify these components, knowing that there is not going to be any centralized management of them? And there's a variety of techniques that you can do. A lot of them involve heavily levels of like fuzzy matching, which by nature, if you're going to use fuzzy matching, that means that it's going to be fuzzy. It's not going to be 100% accurate, right, associated with that. And so another challenge, and kind of going back to my original example with my customer dealing with FDA, is they wanted that customer to produce a VEX document for every single file in their embedded device. That was tens of thousands of files, because they had a false understanding that each individual file was a unique package, when oftentimes that is very rare. Oftentimes these files are these are collection of files, which could be hundreds, even thousands of files individually, that then make up one particular package, right? You go to OpenSSL, libcrypto, the Linux kernel, for example. Some people are shipping the whole Linux kernel, right, on their devices, and you have to find a way to then package that up. And it just made absolutely no sense whatsoever. So I think that is going to continue on the identification side to be a struggle from just a purely what is this C++ package. But that is only like part one of the challenge in the C++ space. Part two of the challenge, in my opinion, is how do you, I continue to emphasize this concept of unique identification. And so if I have, OpenSSL or libc or whatever package that I'm using, and I'm using it on Ubuntu or Debian or, a Conan package instead, all of these different ecosystems, all these different environments, in theory, these are all unique packages, and they should, in theory, could have their own set of vulnerabilities, and in theory, can be completely different from a risk standpoint. And oftentimes, what you get back are things like generic pearls, where you just say, like, "Great, I'm using OpenSSL generically. You decide which ecosystem you would like to go to then be able to relate." And there's ways that people worked around that. CPE is one of those ways. I think CP is absolutely terrible, mostly just because the spec is oftentimes non-deterministic, so it makes it incredibly challenging to determine, is this meant for unique identification or is this meant for vulnerability lookup, because those are two different challenges. Or with like Conan, for example, Conan is kind of more of a distribution method. And so it doesn't have unique bones. Like NVIDIA is not publishing Conan specific vulnerabilities, or no other data source is. So you always have to do some level of fuzzy matching to say, great, show me across every Linux ecosystem that I know about how this package is particularly infected. What's the collection of vulnerabilities? And then you can then, safely use a VEX statement to decide which ones actually affect or impact your specific usage of that package. And that is very transparently tedious. And then I don't want to shy away from that, which is why I think you do have to find automated ways by which to at least automate as much of that work as possible. And then you dig in manually on the triage side. But C++ will continue to be a Wild West. You're absolutely right that it's not a solved problem. But I do think with a combination of various C++ analysis techniques in order for you to use fuzzy matching to get decent components, plus a level of fuzzy matching associated with the Linux ecosystems that allows for you to roughly, to the best of your ability, get to a point where you have decent coverage, and then you can communicate that all in a VEX document.
100%. Before we go too far into this, I do want to talk about a little case study that we ran into, but you brought up CPEs, and I'd love to pick your brain on your thoughts of pearls as opposed to CPEs. I'll go first. I can't stand using CPEs. It ends up with us having dozens more vulnerabilities than are actually going to be applicable. It's much more prone to false positives, and I feel like far less accurate to give you a real risk portrayal. Yes. But now that I've biased the conversation, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
No, you are speaking to the choir on that one, man. I absolutely despise CPEs. Once again, I think it was a very high quality intentional spec, and CPEs are necessary, right? To get the elephant out of the room. The big thing that CPE has over Perl, in my opinion, is support for commercial vulnerabilities. Perl, at least to this day, still does not have a solid way by which to properly associate commercial vulns. And I think that going through a loop of having to produce a unique type per commercial package that you're putting out there in the world to then associate vulnerabilities is probably like a long uphill battle that I don't see happening in the short term. And that's where CPEs does continue to provide value. Outside of that, very, very limited value, in my opinion. Primarily, and it's not, like I said, it's not the CPE spec's fault in and of itself as much as the implementation of how people have decided to use CPEs. We oftentimes see things where, the naming convention is really off. And so you might have a package name with like uppercase and lowercase and hyphens and things of that nature one way. And if you're using tooling that doesn't know to then properly parse those CPEs, those could be viewed as unique vulnerabilities. The other piece is the heavy usage of wildcards. And so oftentimes, I'll see a CPE that basically just has like a package name, a package version, and everything else is a wildcard. And so I'm like, great. You're like, okay, so you're saying find every vulnerability in the history of OpenSSL, for example, across every single version sometimes too. And I'm just like, there's no way that you can say that this is valuable or useful to you. So I am incredibly biased towards Perl, I think, being a more powerful and sufficient spec, and then falling back to CPE in the cases where I think it falls over, which is primarily generic pearls and then commercial vulnerabilities.
I saw that we just had a question come in as well. So is OMB's rollback of a universal SBOM requirement actually impactful for healthcare, or were SBOM expectations already primarily driven by sector-specific regulation and risk? I could share kind of my perspective, and then I'll turn it over to you, Cortez. So we're seeing that healthcare is generally a slow to adapt industry just by nature of how tight regulations need to be around safety and around control. We often even see certain guidance frameworks or certain development frameworks that are untouched for a decade just due to how slow these regulations change and evolve. I think within healthcare specifically, it was a little bit of the Wild West until 2023 when globally regulators really started to get a good picture for what can happen when things go wrong, and understanding how the supply chain is such a big part of that and understanding what we need to do to control risk. So I think that within healthcare specifically, it is very sector driven. And risk is calculated uniquely as opposed to, say, financial data or the legal industry. You don't have to factor in the same tangible patient harm. So I think that it's a very different approach that we're taking there, but love to hear your thoughts as well, Cortez.
Yeah, no, I think this is a fantastic question, by the way, PC. Thank you for raising it. I completely agree with you, Trevor. I think the cat's out the bag on this one. And I think it'll be really, really difficult to kind of roll back this requirement. Something I think was always interesting is if you look across the regulations, most of them actually don't call out SBOMs directly. They always say something more like an inventory of bespoke assets, right? Or something of that nature. And I think that that is by design, because ultimately all SBOMs is another way to deliver that same problem and that same pain point. And so regardless of what I do see as probably some softening of language to move away from an SBOM itself as like that firm concept, I think that inventory bespoke assets will always be required. And I think that the FDA space, in particular on the medical devices side, is showing no sign of showing down that particular requirement. So
100%.
Yeah.
Well, I'd love to talk about a case study that recently came up with a manufacturer that we were working with, specifically relating to this SBOM problem. So they came to us pretty early on. They were developing a software as a medical device that you could hook into a local network, and then it hooks into various different hospital services. It was a complicated system, and they brought in hundreds of components. This is very common, especially within the software as a medical device space, to see a wide range of components coming in. But they luckily paused before moving forward too far and into their design freeze. And they came to us and said, okay, what do we do about this? We're a little concerned about the amount of complexity that's getting in here. And I asked them, well, what are you doing about it? And they went, well, we're, going through the vulnerabilities. Occasionally we'll run some dynamic testing against it or some static code testing and see what comes back. When I asked them about what are you doing for your SBOM, it was crickets. And so we got more into a little bit of the process. Our solution and what we wanted to do to get this in place was having automated SBOM management within their CI/CD. I think this is an amazing advantage of FOSSA, as well as being able to hook it directly into your version control. And as you're working through your code, this is an automatic process. I encourage absolutely every company out there building a medical device to make this today part of your automated process. You shouldn't be generating an SBOM towards the end. You should be generating it as a cyclical process. For any CVEs that were coming up, we were actually understanding what is the applicability. As I'm sure you can imagine, with hundreds of components, we brought back thousands of CVEs. And this was another point of, okay, what are we going to do about this? This is too much work. We don't know how to manage all of this. And we had to go, okay, let's figure out what actually matters here. Let's really drill down into the specific points and the things that an attacker could actually take advantage of. This approach worked great. Once it came time for their submission to the FDA, after they had exited their design freeze, they had this SBOM ready to go. It wasn't a push. It wasn't an effort to create it. It was just there. And it made it so much easier. And I think that, for a lot of manufacturers, if you're going, well, we're already in our design freeze and we're getting worried about this, now what do we do? Today is still the right time to start. The best time was definitely yesterday to build the SBOM, but the sooner you can get this put together, the more information you're going to get. And that's ultimately what this is about, is conveying a good profile of risk and understanding how to be actionable about it.
Now, I absolutely love this case study, by the way, Trevor. And the one thing I love about it is it takes like a really sober approach to say, you know what, as much as, even me as a product leader for an SBOM tool, I would love to say that FOSSA is a magic bullet to solve all your SBOM problems, but it's not. Ultimately, it takes a combination of those people and process. And so you're going to have something automated in place on a regular basis. You're going to have the muscle and capacity to then be able to review vulnerabilities on a regular basis. And then you're going to have to constantly update them. And I think that, to your point, it can feel very overwhelming if you're only doing that prior to your either release cycle or an FDA process. It feels much better if you're doing it on a continuous basis, by which then now you're just doing these incremental changes rather than, kind of waking up and feeling like you have all the chores on your laundry list to do for the weekend. So
100%. All right. Well, in the FDA regulatory process, cybersecurity is one of the most common reasons that medical devices get pushed back right now. Of course, it's not the only reason, but even within cybersecurity, SBOMs are one of the most common reasons that we get some pushback from. I was thinking to the example that you were talking about where the FDA was coming back and asking for a file by file and a line by line SBOM. I think I remember that exact situation, actually. But it is unbelievably prevalent. And I think it's because there isn't enough information out there, and it's just not standard practice within the healthcare space at this point. I think that we're getting there, but we're seeing so many different problems, missing components. We don't actually have the level of detail. We're only generating an SBOM for this specific application, not the entire ecosystem. And then one thing you mentioned earlier, Cortez, was incomplete SBOMs from suppliers. And this is a monstrous problem to deal with. If you're pulling in a component into your medical device, you're not always going to be able to rely on open source everything, as much as the open source community wishes that you could. But there are always going to be some closed source or some licensed components that you get, and you ask them, hey, what's under the hood? And if you don't get any response, what do you do about that?
No, it's a really good question. One, you should fire them as a supplier. But no, jokes aside, assuming that you can't do that, there's a couple of options that you have. I do think that there's a lot of binary composition analysis product out there, FOSSA being one of them, very transparently. And I do think that binary decomposition is a better approach than no SBOM, but will inherently be noisy because of just the nature of that technology. Most binary analysis tooling at a high level is looking to look for archives and targets, how many zip files, jar files, archives do you have, jars within jars, until you find a .so, a .h, file that you can then actually relate to some type of open source database to get a sense of what they are using. And so that is a decent approach. So that way you're kind of better than nothing. There are alternatives though. And something that we've seen really popular with our customers is using SBOM requirements within their procurement cycles. And so the next time that you're actually renewing a requirement with that particular vendor, you say, great. If we are going to renew this, I need a firm requirement or SOW that you will produce an SBOM on a release basis. And if you don't, here's the financial consequences associated with that. The moment you put a little financial consequences in there, the vendors tend to start acting a little bit more nicely and boldly to you. So those are two ways that they can go about it. Often, sometimes two, you'll get a sense of a closed source component, but we'll have an open source version. And so a lot of times you can go to the open source version, while it's not a one-to-one mapping, you can at least get a sense of what the underlying tech stack is, and then ask them to kind of fill in the gaps. Last, and the last option is ultimately, as much as I would love to have a formal SBOM in a CycloneDX or SPDX format that's machine readable, Excel still continues to run the world, and Google Sheets still continue to run the world. And so worst case scenario, you jump on a call with that supplier, you say, hey, we got to go line by line, one by one, until you tell me exactly the components that you're using, what their name and version and ecosystem is. And then you essentially have a manual SBOM. I absolutely despise that last option, but you got to do what you got to do in order to get through some of these FDA submissions.
100%. And we have unfortunately had to go through that manual solution more often than we would like to, but it's, like you said, it's what you have to do. And I think that the industry as a whole is getting better. We do see, very, very happy to say that we do see medical device manufacturers thinking about this earlier. Yeah. And so we have them, we get a lot of requests. What should we do? What factors do we need to consider when we're trying to associate a component with our product? The manufacturer is the one who takes on the risk. If there's a vulnerability or problem in a component in your SBOM, it's not the component manufacturer who's liable. It is the medical device manufacturer. So they're the ones that need to be responsible for this. I think when we go into how we can apply this in a broad range and how we can scale this, it really, really does become important to have this as an automated process. I say that we've done this before for, a device here or there, but this is with us as a well-equipped, dedicated security team. This is the only thing that we do. And we're often larger than the security teams at some of the massive medical companies that we work with, just solely because we purely focus on cybersecurity. And so now imagine you're, a large strategic medical device manufacturer with a thin security team, which is unfortunately often the case. And you have to manually go through this process for a product portfolio of hundreds of devices. It would take years to get through this. So I think it's really important to understand what we can get in place at a high level to automate this, to get things hooked into our CI/CD pipeline, to automate the generation of the SBOM, ideally to use Vex to triage exploits as quickly as possible and actually have real insight into what matters and what doesn't. As kind of the next part of this is really understanding once something doesn't matter, make sure that it's flagged as such so that you aren't generating the same false flags 100 times over as you're going through this process. But what are some of the good strategies that you can employ to try to scale this process for a larger company with wide product portfolio?
Yeah, this is such like an interesting challenge because I do think that the SBOM management challenge is actually not that bad if you only have like one product that you're shipping with one development team who can
Yep.
be incredibly hands-on, right? The moment you start saying this around hundreds or thousands of products on a regular basis, and that becomes challenging. We have a few customers that upload, 20 to 30,000 SBOMs on a weekly basis, to our platform.
Wow.
Because that is how often they are shipping and releasing code. And there's no way that they'd be able to do that without being kind of fully automated. So there's a few things that you're going to want to do. First, you have to like get an understanding of what's actually shipping into production. As much as I would love for everyone to be a good steward of their code bases and have an SBOM for everything, no matter what, I think focusing on just your production releases is going to be the best place for you to start. And so it's most important that your SBOM is a one-to-one mapping to something that's actually out there in the real world or about to be released. Out there in the real world. I think from there, you then want to kind of curate the packages that you're detecting on whatever that tooling is, and that should happen on an automated basis. By curate, that could be things like labels, that could be scopes. What you're looking to do is get a determination between what are actually production runtime packages that I'm actually including in my production environment, or what's like a dev and test dependency that I'm only using for test purposes or to compile the application or something of that nature. Ultimately, while yes, you can still include those, you want to label them as such, so then that way you're not surfacing any false positive risk that it doesn't actually impact or isn't actually exploitable, by which to actually have the application deployed on a regular basis. Thirdly, I will continue to hammer home the need for the unique identification. The only way that you're going to be able to get continuous vulnerability analysis is to be able to truly uniquely identify that, ideally through a fully qualified Perl. And so name, spec, ecosystem, being able to understand beyond just name and version, which is the cop-out for most people. They stop at name and version. I'm telling you that is insufficient. You have to be able to have a high-quality ecosystem to relate it back to, whether that be pip, npm, one of the Linux distributions. It could even be GitHub if you're getting it directly from source, but at least having one place to go back to so you can then directly correlate that. The last piece, then, I would say tie your VEX process into your ticketing system of choice. And so if you are a Jira shop, you're a ServiceNow shop, whatever it is that you're using, GitHub issues, having a way by which that your developers never have to go into whatever this platform is. So you generate an SBOM that then loads any issues that surface into your developer's ticketing system of choice. They can immediately triage those right within the workflow that they already have and then give you a response. That's going to be the best way to implement this at scale, because as much as I love the fancy UIs that we build in our application, the vast majority of developers don't want to use them. They want to stay within the workflows by which that they already have, because that allows for them to be efficient, high velocity, and I'm sure to start leveraging Cloud and a lot of the tooling to help in that process as well. And so those are some of the big things that I want to call out. And the last thing too is oftentimes you're going to have to combine multiple SBOMs together, because you either have multi-stage builds, you're combining with the supplier vendor that we talked about previously, they're coming from different parts of your P&L. And so having a process in place by which that you can generate the individual SBOMs along the way and then combine them together with the container SBOM, with the application SBOM, with the embedded SBOM will then give you this final artifact that you can then ship, and that's what you want to provide to the FDA. And so those are some of the strategies that I would use, but 100% you're going to need tooling in place. Whether you build it yourself, whether you do something commercial, you cannot do this on a manual basis if you're going to be able to do it at scale.
Definitely. Yeah, I think the tooling is the most important part. You're very right. Developers are not going to want to change what tooling they're already using. And so making it as seamless as possible for your developers is going to be a great way to go about this. I saw that we got a question in. What tools generally used to score CVEs for SBOMs? So SBOMs, when we have a Perl that is mapping it back to a specific component and saying, oh, we're pulling all these vulnerabilities. Generally, those vulnerabilities and the CVE scores are going to be pulled from the NVD, the National Vulnerability Database. And so what we're trying to do within the SBOM is match the component to the registry of the CVEs. So we aren't usually doing any unique scoring. This information has already been provided, but that's where we generally pull this data in as the sources. And I know there are a lot of different resources for this. The NVD is generally the standard one, but a lot of different tools will have a proprietary system. A lot of different tools will pull from some different data sources. And so there's no one solved solution, but the NVD would be the closest thing there.
Yeah, no, not too much to add there. I'd say the NVD is definitely close. There's all kinds of like osv.dev and GitHub service advisories. There's a ton of different data sources that you can get it from. As long as you have that high quality Perl, that's going to be your best starting point, and then you can associate vulnerabilities after that. And then of course make sure that you incorporate your internal context. If a particular CVE says it requires network access, but your particular package or your particular product doesn't have network access whatsoever, not saying you can completely ignore it, but you're probably relatively safe from that particular CVE, and you can adjust accordingly.
All right. I'd like to talk about another similar use case where we have had actually a really positive use case for SBOMs. And so one part of SBOMs is the components are going to get CVEs. There's only so much that you can do about that. You can't prevent the CVEs from happening. I think part of the best value for an SBOM is being able to respond so fast. And so this was a device manufacturer that we were working with where they had a great SBOM in place, or a great SBOM process in place. It was airtight. They were generating it and changing it throughout their development lifecycle. Nothing was done ad hoc as a dedicated manual process. It was really flexible. And a situation came up where a major CVE, a critical vulnerability, this is a network connected product, and so this is especially applicable in a widely used library that they happen to be using, hits and they're affected. Yeah. Now, as opposed to going and tracking down, okay, do we use this library? If so, where do we use it? If so, is the CVE applicable? Which can take days of trying to triage in a complicated environment. They already knew. Their SBOM flagged it the second the notification was published. They had this information available. Because they had such a clean process, this manufacturer had multiple different devices, some of which were using this library and some of which weren't. This further complicates the problem if they do this manually. But because they have this strong SBOM process in place, they immediately flagged the devices that actually have this vulnerability. They were able to push out a assessment. They were able to push out a plan of attack in a matter of hours, as opposed to having to wait days to try to track down all of this information, at which point, who's to say if the devices can already be compromised by a threat actor? So I think this really does go to showcase how effective it can be to use an SBOM effectively and really have this as a baked in part of your process. It can really change the game for security.
No, we are. It's so interesting because I think this is incredibly timely across the board. I think there's like two interesting pieces of this case study for me. One is their ability to respond quickly, which means, to your point, they already had high quality SBOMs in place. You already had high quality tooling in place to then be able to query that database of your choice. But then also having a really efficient delivery method by which to then provide that patch version after you've kind of made that. And I think that secondary piece is something that a lot of people aren't always thinking about. The medical device space is definitely a challenging one for that. The automotive device space is also equally as challenging. And so I think this like move, for a long time, there was a fear of OTA updates, I think, in these particular industries because of, what threat actors can do. But it's almost like a firm requirement at this point if you're going to be able to adapt and adjust to how quickly the threat actors are going to come. And so, I think about, Axios malware that happened recently. I think about the Trivia malware, the Light LLM. I think we're only going to continue to see beyond just CVEs, just straight up compromised packages in the future. And your ability to respond to them quickly is going to be critical.
100%. Yeah, I really like what you mentioned about OTA updates. This is something that we get as a question. I think it's part of this old mentality within, doing an over-the-air update. But we'll get a lot of questions from medical device manufacturers. We really, really, really want to have over-the-air updates, but we don't know if we are going to be in trouble with the regulators if we do this. And we go, no, this is 100% what you need to do. You're going to be in more trouble with the regulators if you don't do this. You need to still prove that you can reliably push out updates. Yes. And if you have these channels developed in place, regulators are reasonable. The FDA wants to see that you have done your due diligence with cybersecurity. Nothing is going to be perfect, and they know that. They want to know that when something happens, you can respond. You can detect, you can turn around, and you can fix it. And that's ultimately what we're talking about here with this whole SBOM flow, and then tying it back into overall risk management. Yeah. So this is a little bit of a unique lens within medical that you wouldn't necessarily see in some other spaces, which is how we are actually trying to evaluate risk in a component, since we're factoring it in from two sides. In the medical space, we are going through the traditional safety risk assessment based on ISO 14971 that everyone in the healthcare space is very well familiar with. And this is focused on very different metrics, but a similar process to security risk management. We're more looking at the probability of occurrence and the severity of impact if something were to go wrong. We can stem this then into AMI-TIR 57, which was the bridge between safety and security. Now we're seeing AMI-SW 96 as a bit more of a whole end-to-end lifecycle solution. But this is where we really do talk about exploitability as our access metric, I guess I can refer it to. You can't say likelihood, you can't say probability, and for very good reason in the cybersecurity space. But when we're looking at what is important with evaluating the safety risk, it is inherently going to be a security problem. Finding a vulnerability in an SBOM, you're not going to be able to directly attribute a safety problem to it, but you can attribute a security problem that could lead to a safety problem. So this cross evaluation is critical. I think that Vex does a really good job at helping this, because it can ease on these exploitability process. So as we're going through the assessment, a full formal risk assessment does take time. If we can say that this vulnerability actually is not exploitable, we don't need to go through the same level of effort, and we can reprioritize things that do matter, especially when we're in the final crunch time getting ready for a submission.
Yeah, one thing I really like about this is I'm not sure, how familiar your audience is with the SSVC, the stakeholder-specific vulnerability categorization. CISA put out this framework a long time ago that I think is overly verbose, but it's like fantastic in spirit from the lens of you want to think about vulnerability assessment as almost like an if this then that statement, right? And so you say, great, am I exploitable? Okay, yes, I'm exploitable. Is this on a particular asset that I care about that's deployed? Is that widely spread, or is it only from a minimal perspective? Is this more of like an internal tool? Is it externally facing, right? All these decision points can kind of go in to that tree for you to decide, do I need to stop everything that I'm doing right now at this moment, break glass in case of emergency and patch this vulnerability? Can I put this onto my next sprint planning process? Can I put this on my backlog for the second half of the year because it's a relatively low severity or low EPSS score, and we've determined that it's not exploitable? And so having all that data to then make those decisions and trade-offs, I think is most important, because the reality is, as much as I would love for everyone to treat security as the only thing that they do as an organization, we're still shipping products here, right? Across the board. We have to ship products, we have to ship functionality, we have to continue to service our customers and provide them value across the board. And so in order to do that, while security can't be an afterthought, it does have to be a part of that prioritization process, not the only thing in that prioritization process.
100%. Yeah. And I think one issue is being in the security space, it is the only thing that we think about. And so then when you go, well, what do you mean you can't make all passwords 24 characters long? What do you mean a doctor doesn't want to do that? They should just do it. Then we get a lot of pushback. And that's a whole other conversation of what is good enough security and what is not good enough security. But I think there are definitely some lines that we see with not good enough security. We see a lot of deficiencies coming back relating to SBOMs, a lot from the FDA. So we really do want to make sure that we have this buttoned down. Some of the more common problems that we're going to see are relating to the detail or the complexity of an SBOM. If the regulators don't feel that we're actually covering the full system, or if they don't feel that we're covering the system in enough detail, they're going to come back with concerns. This will go back to what you mentioned earlier about the FDA requesting a file by file software bill of materials. They're trying to go for this depth. Maybe they're going about it in a little bit of an uninformed way based on the specific context of this product, but that's ultimately the goal that they're trying to do. Another big problem that we see is the tie-in across different divisions. This is especially going to be prevalent within a large organization, but getting a good, clear expectation from quality, from regulatory that translates to product security on what do we actually need to do with this SBOM? What are the requirements around it? It's one thing to have the SBOM. It's one thing to collect all this data, but it's another to understand what you're actually supposed to do with it. This SBOM is meant to be a user-facing component. It's part of your software or it's part of your cybersecurity labeling for a medical device. This isn't something that you're keeping an internal secret. This is part of the point, is to try to have a little bit more openness and transparency on what we're doing in the product. And then this will go back to the original point, but another common problem that we see is you just completely forgot the SBOM for this component. We couldn't get the SBOM for this component because it's closed source. That's not our problem. You got to figure this out. You should have chosen a better vendor. You should have generated the SBOM. But I'd be curious to hear, Cortez, I'm sure you also see a lot of different problems coming back and a lot of complaints on, oh, we're getting pushed back on X, Y, and Z. What are some of the issues that you see around SBOM management, and what are some of the ways that we can mitigate them?
Yeah, I absolutely love this question. One, first and foremost, going back to your original comment, I absolutely agree that there's too many gaps in the security space and probably not enough people doing it good enough. You'll have to invite me back for a future webinar and we can riff on that one for an hour, because I would love that. Nonetheless, I think some of the most common gaps that I see from an SBOM perspective is definitely the lack of proper unique identifiers. I really think that like generic Perl name and version is such a cop-out, because there's nothing you can really do useful with that information. Yes, you can do some guesses. You can try to enrich yourself. There's things that absolutely, like, both we as tooling and other people will try, but ultimately you want to have a completely uniquely identified package so you're explicit about where these net new vulnerabilities should come from. I think another piece of that is something I like to think about SBOMs in static versus dynamic information. Static information, think of like, hey, unless you're shipping new code, the package, name, the version, supplier, author information, none of that's probably going to change, but net new vulnerabilities are going to change. And then support information is also going to change. So is this being actively maintained or is it end of life? And that is actually a really tricky determination in the open source space in particular, because the reality is there's actually not like a centralized database of open source maintainers saying like, yes, I'm actually formally saying this is end of life. Most of them just kind of like call it quits, right? And just walk away and go on to other things. And so they've effectively abandoned the project. And so having to be able to clearly articulate what packages that you're using that are being actively maintained, which I know is hard to distinguish between, yes, it's actively maintained, but there just is not any need to update at this time, which is its own challenge in and of itself. The last gap that I see is not wanting to acknowledge certain dependency scopes, which is really where you get in trouble by just removing certain dependencies. And so yes, and I think I kind of called it earlier, how you really want to think about like dev and test dependencies. If you remove them completely, that's fine. I think it's better if you include them and you at least articulate the usage, then that way you can have that full dependency graph. Oftentimes you'll actually like walk the dependency tree and the relationships and you'll see gaps in there and you're like, whoa, like this doesn't make sense. Like this, kind of leaf and node situation isn't working out the way that I would expect it to. And that is primarily because they just completely removed dependencies without any context on where they are and how they were used or how they were relevant. And so I think to your point, the FDA knows that you're looking to do a best effort here. You're better off presenting as much information as possible while being transparent about what's actually in use than you are about just arbitrarily deleting things and then having gaps in your entire graph, which I think immediately shows up as a red flag for any competent reviewer. So
100%. Yeah, I think that what you brought up on with the transparency part is extremely important here. I know we are coming up on time, and so we've gone over a lot about what a sustainable SBOM program looks like. I am going to breeze over this case study real quick, but this is the one thing that I do want to touch on before we wrap up here, which is future-proofing this process. So if you're to take anything away from this, understand how to automate this, understand how to make this an important part of your development lifecycle. Mm-hmm. I think this is the best way for me to sum up my key takeaways from this is this shouldn't be a manual push. This should be just an easy flow in your development cycle. You shouldn't have to go through an effort to develop the SBOM at the end. It should be there. You should just be ready to go forward with that submission. I think it's really important as well to make sure that you are, and you touched up on this point earlier, that SBOMs should be a contract requirement for any suppliers. If you do not provide an SBOM for this component, this is what we're going to have to do. Regulators are not messing around with this. They don't want to see excuses for, oh, we weren't able to, find this SBOM. They want to see that you did your due diligence to bring in a quality product and get this ready for submission. I'd love to hear any of your closing thoughts, Cortez, anything that I missed, and some of the key takeaways that anyone listening should take away with their SBOM program.
Yeah, I absolutely love these bullets across the board, and particularly that third one, which is ship regulatory ready by default. I think there's so many things that kind of go into that. And so the more that you start to treat your software supply chain program like this is a daily habit, just like you brushing your teeth, making your bed, or any of your other, high quality habits that you have, the better situation that you're going to be in. The more that you treat this as like a point in time activity that I have to react to, that's going to be the harder point. And so like when I look across my customer base, the ones who are most successful are the ones that are fully integrated. They're generating SBOMs on every build that they're possibly creating. They're storing those SBOMs. They're constantly annotating them with next new vulnerabilities when VEX is coming out. And while that sounds overwhelming, it sounds like a lot of work, it actually becomes significantly less work if you're doing it on a regular basis as compared to if you're treating it from a point in time perspective. And so I absolutely love that. And then I think the last thing too is there's a cultural piece to like future proofing this process. That is to say that, as I'm sure you experience, you want to be developer friendly to the most part. And so if you come in and you say, you know what, we're going to shut down all your builds, we're going to fail them, we're going to stop you from deploying unless you do all these things, I think you're going to come off as an adversary to your own internal champions who you really want to work for you. How you want to present this is actually, you know what, we want to do this on an ongoing basis. So that way I'm not harassing you for 12 hours on the last night until midnight in the morning in order to kind of do this rush process. Instead, what I want is on a continuous basis for you to already have the SBOMs built. I'm not going to fail your builds. I'm not going to stop you in any material way. We'll continue to review the vulnerabilities based on our SLAs and SLOs for the particular vulnerability categorizations that we have. And then when it comes time to do a submission, it's an easy process. It's an easy check mark at that particular time. So those are some of my closing thoughts for you. I really appreciate you having me on. It was really engaging, Trevor, and some good conversations.
I absolutely love it. Yeah, this has been fantastic. I'm really glad that we got to dive into this. I think this is a really important topic right now. And I think that we have been able to cover some ground and shed a little bit of light on exactly what does matter here. As always, it's been fantastic doing a webinar. We'll have to get back and dive into some more of the typical security problems that we see. That would be a fun next one. But yeah, I'm really glad that you're able to jump on. As kind of the wrap up here, for anything relating to your medical device, if you're moving forward into an FDA submission, if you have questions on what these process needs to be, please reach out to us over at Blue Goat Cyber. We're here to help. We're here to get involved, and we really do want to be your partner and support you through this process. Similarly, if you need any help with managing your SBOM, if you need this tool in place, and if your developers are saying, look, this is too much work for us, this is where you turn to FOSSA. They do an amazing job at making this a streamlined process, and it's a great tool for really ensuring that you are shipping a regulatory ready product. It's been fantastic having you on, Cortez, and yeah, looking forward to the next one.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Trevor. It was great.
Thank you.